Our first scripture lesson for today comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. And I encourage you to listen for God's word speaking to you. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and the water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And our second reading comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. Again, listen for the Lord speaking to you. And this is Jesus speaking. "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me, and I in them, bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing." Family, this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, our daughter Hannah has approached that age where she has learned all of the boundaries that we have set for her and is now moving to the phase where she likes to test all of the boundaries that we set for her. And right now that's coming in the form of opposing pretty much everything that we say or tell her to do. For instance, if we're driving home and she starts to complain to me or grumble to me that we are not home yet, I say to Hannah, "It's okay, Hannah, we're really close." And she'll reply, "No, open." Open being the opposite of close. Or another example, in the mornings when she eats her cereal and I have to tell her, "Hannah, we do not put our hands in the cereal with the milk," and she'll go like this. But the height of her rebelliousness comes every day when we take our dogs for a walk and we go down our quiet little street and we reach the point where we get to almost the end of the road and it's time for us to turn around and make our way back to the house. And lately, this has been the point where Hannah has decided that she wants to continue to run further. And she'll say, "No, I'm going to keep on going this way, this way." And Rachel and I have tried every single strategy in the book to try to convince Hannah to come back with us when we tell her to come back with us. We have tried reasoning and negotiating with her. Reasoning and negotiating with the 2.5-year-old does not work, I'll tell you that. We have tried being very firm and direct. And that gets her home, but it's quite a scene getting her home. Those of you in the congregation here have probably heard us in the neighborhood when we have tried that strategy. But lately we figured out that the best way to get Hannah to turn around and to come back with us is to simply let her go out a little bit as we turn around and make our way back home. And every time we do that, there is this distance that Hannah can tolerate between between herself and us. And once that distance has passed, something changes very suddenly in her. And she comes running back to us. And she goes back to the house with us every time. But I always wonder, what happens in her mind that changes her world so quickly? What changes in the way that she looks at herself, in her confidence or maybe lack thereof to be on her own? What changes in her perception of the world around her that very suddenly becomes a dangerous place? Whatever's going through her head, I've seen this happen now enough times to understand that there is an impact that Hannah feels when she becomes more and more distant from her parents. And that you can find that with real evidence of what happens to her. Well, as we have been going along with the Israelites as they journey through the desert after being freed from captivity, but they're wandering in the desert, we are now beginning to see evidence of the impact that the Israelites are feeling as they continue to distance themselves from the Lord. So just to bring us back up to speed, a few weeks ago, we were with the Israelites when they had just crossed over the Red Sea. It was this amazing moment where God delivered them from the Egyptians, and they began to complain. And right there, we started to see the distance that the Israelites were putting between themselves and the Lord as they chose to trust in their own strength, in their own mind, and their own intellect instead of the Lord. And that began to impact them. And then 2 weeks ago, we saw that as they continued to wander into the wilderness a little bit more, they became thirsty, and they began to complain and grumble and moan and groan to Moses. And we saw that their distance that they continue to put between themselves and the Lord began to impact their hearts, and it began to impact the way that they see themselves as they started to adopt a spirit of grumbling. Well, now we're starting to see what happens as they continue to keep this distance from the Lord, because they're not learning their lesson. They're not trusting in the Lord. They continue to go on their own strength, and they continue to rely only on their human leadership. And now we're seeing evidence of more effects of the distance between them and God. And now we're starting to see how it is impacting their relationships with one another. As they make their way through the wilderness and they're finding themselves again thirsty, they don't go to the Lord, but they go to Moses and they quarrel with him. They quarrel with him. And it's here we're beginning to see evidence of the withering of a relationship because of the absence of the Lord's guidance in that relationship. Now, a few weeks ago, we gathered here and we were in a different sermon series that was exploring vibrant congregations. And we saw how vibrant congregations understand the inevitability of conflict in our relationships and how vibrant congregations will find ways to resolve those conflicts in a healthy manner. But at this point, it's important to understand the difference between conflict and quarreling. When we find ourselves in conflict, this is when we have two different people or two different groups of people, two different organizations, whomever, with different opinions on something. And those differences of opinions bring them into conflict with one another. And that's inevitable, right? As human beings, we will always find ourselves in conflict one way or another. And that's okay. Because conflict is simply the presence of a difference of opinions, and there is always a way to get through conflict. There is always a way when we find ourselves in a conflict with someone to get together with them and to find a healthy way to resolve that conflict. But this is not what is happening with the Israelites, because they don't find themselves in conflict with Moses. They are quarreling with Moses. And when we quarrel with people, we are not trying to find a solution to the differences in opinion. But rather, we are trying to bite and devour and kill one another who are not meeting our own expectations or the expectations that we set for ourselves. And what we're seeing here is the continued absence of the Lord's love. And now we're seeing it manifest itself in the Israelites' relationships with one another. And without God's love and without God's guidance, again, the presence that they are rejecting, we're starting to see their relationships wither and die. You know, in our own lives, it's really easy to have a relationship with someone and to keep up a relationship or to maintain a relationship with people who serve a need that we have. It's easy to love our friends because we enjoy spending time with them and we have fun together. And maybe they help us be better people, but when it really boils down to it, our friends are the people that we enjoy spending time with. And so for that reason, it's easy to love them. It's easy to love and to have a relationship with our family most of the time. But there is something about our family. They offer us a sense of belonging. They offer us a sense of protection. They offer us a sense of acceptance, even if they don't agree with all of our life's choices. And of course, it's easy to have a relationship with our coworkers and our bosses and the people maybe who work for us because we have a job to do. We have a living to make. We have people to provide for. And so these are relationships that we have to maintain in order to provide for ourselves and our families. These are all the relationships in our lives that somehow benefit us. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I simply show those to show that there are certain relationships where it's easier to love certain people when we have some skin in the game. But what about the people in our world where the benefit of maintaining a relationship with them, the benefits are not as obvious? What about the family down the road who relies on our generosity so that they can feed their kids on the weekend? What about a person or maybe a group of people whom society has given us permission in a way to cast aside and to block out? What about the person in our lives that drive us crazy? And you know who I'm talking about, right? The person who watches that news station when we like to watch this news station. Life presents us with different types of relationships with people from all across the board. And we are called to love those people. And we are called to lift those people up, and we are called to seek them out. And sometimes that's hard. And if we rely on our own strength in all of our relationships, if we leave God out of our relationships, if we do not allow God's love to guide us in every single relationship we have, we run the same risk that the Israelites found themselves in, which is seeing their relationships wither and die, and they devolved into a group of people who were quarreling with one another and biting and devouring one another and only rallying around people who serve their own interests. And the reason for this is that God's love for us gives us the capacity to love others in a way that we could not do so on our own. Let me repeat that. God's love for us, that He gives to us graciously and freely and abundantly, gives us the capacity to love others in a way that we would never bite and devour them or quarrel with them. And that's why I love the image that Jesus puts forth when he tells us that he is the vine and we are his branches. And it's a reminder that we don't have to rely on our own strength and our own love all the time in order to love others and to be in the types of relationships with others that God calls us to have. But rather, if we find that our well is running dry, we can go back and draw from the source of life, which is Jesus Christ himself, who, like a vine giving life to its branches and its grapes and its fruit, offers us abundant love, not just for our own sake, but so that the relationships in our lives may have fruit. And so that when we run into difficulty, that the well doesn't run dry, and so that the relationship does not wither, but rather we all go back and we draw from that source of life, and Christ gives us his love abundantly so that we may have life, and also so that our relationships with one another may be full of love and full of life. So as we leave today, I would like for all of us to examine our relationships. Our relationships with one another, our friends, our family, our co-workers, the people in our community. Is God present in every single one of those relationships? Is God present in our own hearts enough that we go and rely on him to be the source of that love that gives us the capacity to love others in a way that we can't do so on our own? And if there is any doubt, let us remember the promise that Christ gave us to be the true vine. And may we go to that. And may we go to him alone to find that life and that love. To God be all honor and glory and praise. Amen.